I am sure that you have all seen all of the tributes and the memories and all the stuff about 9/11 that are all over the place now because this is the 20th anniversary. And I thought I would tell a different kind of story because I was not an eyewitness. I was not in New York, but I did witness and experience what happened to people who were far removed from the actual events, what the impact of this was on their lives and on my life. And it's, in many ways, it's a story of rumor and a story of conspiracy, and but no less affecting in a lot of ways. I came to the events of 9/11 already kind of wounded. I was less than a year prior to it. In December of the previous year, my own partner had died in a kind of tragic way. And then only a few months before 9/11, a really good friend of mine had been found dead in an equally tragic way. I had just graduated with my PhD. My mother had just taken me to Boston to celebrate my graduation on my birthday. And it turned out, and of course I didn't realize this ironically until much later, but it turned out that our initial flight out of Logan Airport had been delayed, and we ended up having to spend the night at the airport and taking out a commuter flight, which turned out to be a regular commuter flight, one of the regular commuter flights that was later hijacked and then flown into one of the towers. Of course, I didn't know that until later. I didn't figure that out until later. And this had happened about a month beforehand. So, that was one of those weird synchronistic kind of crazy things. And the day that it happened, I had just started teaching an early class, an 8:30 class at Johnson County Community College. I was one of the few people that would volunteer to teach an 8:30 class. And it was an early class in the sense that it was only like the second time we'd met, right after Labor Day and stuff. So it was a short class, and we got out a little bit early. We got out maybe about 9:10 instead of 9:20. And of course, that would have put it right after 10 o'clock New York time. And of course, by that time, both planes had hit the towers. And come to think of it now, I think it was just a little bit after 10 that we got out. And all I know is that we heard some commotion outside in the hall outside the building, and all of a sudden a student who apparently was in the classroom after us burst into the classroom and shouted something like, "We're under attack." And of course, we had no idea what this person was talking about. We were like, "What?" He said, "We're under attack. Planes are hitting the buildings in New York." And we're like, "Okay." Or a plane had hit a building in New York or something like that. I mean, I didn't even completely understand what he said because he was just sort of hysterically, blurting things out. And you have to keep in mind that, we didn't have cell phones. We couldn't just like get on our cell phone and see like what had happened. We were just like, okay. And so I didn't have a class again until the evening. So I went to my office and I tried to get on the internet, and the internet was completely jammed. I mean, keep in mind again, we had the internet, but it was not like the internet we have now. There wasn't nearly as much bandwidth, and you couldn't just like always get on the internet. I mean, it was completely jammed. Could not get on. Could barely get my interoffice email. I went into the office. Nobody knew what had happened. We just heard rumors, and of course, the rumors that we heard in my mind, I just thought, like some small Cessna plane or something had, flown into the World Trade Center, because actually, just not that long earlier, a small plane like that had flown into another building. I think it was like down in Texas or something. I don't even remember. It was somewhere down in the South. That something like that had happened, or had almost happened, just a few months previously. So that's kind of like where my mind went. I think a lot of people's mind went there because they were remembering that news story. Anyway, I got in the car, I drove home. I had to go up I-35 going north, some of you will know, to Kansas City, Kansas. I lived in an apartment that was directly across from KU Med Center at the time. And I noticed that everybody was driving really slowly. They were driving like maybe 55 miles an hour, which is very unusual for that stretch of I-35. If you can get away with it, people drive like bats out of hell. And I got home and I did have cable. I did have cable TV at that time. I turned on the cable television to CNN just in time to see the second tower fall. So I saw that live. And it was not long after that tower. I mean, I didn't even really know exactly what I was looking at. I was not that familiar with New York at the time. I mean, I knew that the World Trade Center existed. I knew that the two towers existed. But at that time, I was still trying to get my mind around what had happened. And I saw the second tower fall, and Aaron Brown was reporting, and there were all of these rumors coming in, broadcast rumors coming in, that there had been there was a fire on the mall, and that a pipe bomb had been exploded outside of the State Department. There were all of these bizarre rumors that he was reporting them, and then he would say, "These are rumors, we haven't verified them." So he was actually very careful about all that kind of stuff. But I remember not long after that tower fell, CNN flashed how many people generally are said to work in those two towers. And I almost got physically ill. I remember I just stood up and I started pacing around in my apartment and just breathing as intensely as I could, because I thought I was going to throw up. It was like this intense sense of dread, because I guess one of my deepest fears is to be buried alive in something like that. I just can't even hardly listen to accounts of that. I mean, even that apartment building that collapsed in Florida not long ago, I could hardly stand to listen to accounts of it, because the idea of being trapped in something like that is almost unbearable for me to think about. And of course, then things just unfolded. They canceled all flights, and I had to go to class that night and try to teach class. And rumors were just flying. People were terrified that there were rumors flying that there were carloads of Arabs driving down K10 and shooting at people, which was not true. There were rumors that the price of gas was going to spike massively. And half of my students were so terrified. This was like only the second time that they had come to class, in this evening class. Several of my students were so terrified that they refused to drive the little distance, the 25, 30 miles of distance from Lawrence to Overland Park to come to class. There were people in Lawrence and on the way who took advantage of the rumors that there was going to be a gas shortage, and they started charging exorbitant amounts for gasoline. I had one student that did show up who paid something like $60 for like 5 gallons of gas or something completely bizarre. And it was just these people taking advantage of the rumors that there might be a gas shortage. It was just completely weird. And then, of course, my students were completely traumatized. Some of them were just scared. and some of them were really angry. And, there were a lot of statements about Muslims and a lot of statements about Islam. And the class almost, when it got out of control at a certain point, and ironically, the first part of the class, I was being evaluated. I was a new hire. And so the chair of the program was evaluating me that night, and he was completely distracted because he had had a nephew that had worked in the North Tower, or that worked in the North Tower. And keep in mind, the only thing he had was, I guess we had like Palm Pilots or something, and I think that's what they were called, where you could send simple messages, but it wasn't like a cell phone. So he was waiting for a message from a relative or from his nephew. It turned out he never did get one that night, but it turned out his nephew was fine. He had gotten out, and in fact, apparently had not gone into work that day for whatever reason, one of those synchronistic reasons, And so it turned out he was fine, but here I am being, evaluated by this guy who's completely distracted because a relative of his is involved in it. And my evaluation was okay. It was fine. I mean, you could tell he was very distracted and had to kind of come up with something to say, but it was fine. And of course, there were lots of things that happened afterwards, and then he left the first hour, and then the second hour was when my class just fell apart. They just fell apart. They were angry. They were crying. We couldn't really have a class. What I basically told them is, look, I got through what I needed to get through in the first hour. And that was for the evaluation. And we just kind of had group therapy is what we did. I mean, I got really angry at a couple of students at one point, although I didn't really show it. But because of stuff that they were saying about Muslims and about Islam and about foreigners and things like that. But I could also tell that they were really scared. And I said to them, listen, I know you're really scared. You're saying things that are nutty right now. And I need you to know that they're nutty. But I also understand that you're just completely freaking out. And they were completely freaking out. So we had, we didn't really have class, the second part of class, and I let them go home early. And then there were just other things, there was an event where, later that week, of course, obviously we didn't, all the flights were canceled. So, the sky became this beautiful, pristine blue because you didn't have, airplanes in the sky. And ironically, of course, about a year ago, when coronavirus was at its height in New York, we had a similar situation because most flights, especially international flights, were canceled out of all of our airports. Those kinds of ironies are just bizarre. There was an incident where a neighbor in the neighborhood that I lived in, which was the Volker Park neighborhood on 39th Street in Kansas City, that there was a guy that everybody knew who lived there. He was a student at K Medical Center, and he was a Sikh, and he had he had taken his girlfriend to get some ice cream at a storefront ice cream place that was there. And while he was there, this car full of Missouri good old boys, there was a truck actually, drove up and started screaming at them, and threatening them. And a bunch of us walked up there to sort of surround them and protect them, and kind of made these guys leave. And of course they were going to, depart with some machismo or whatever we call it. And they gunned their engine and stalled their vehicle so severely that they had to get it towed. And we just thought that was hilarious. We thought that was great karma. There was another incident that happened, like maybe it was 2 weeks later or something. My girlfriend at the time was had stayed over at my apartment. And like I said, I lived right across from KU Med Center. And it was in the morning, and I was awake. I was just sitting up. I think I'd gotten my coffee, but she was still asleep. And then they were doing construction at that time at KU. I think they were like building a new wing or doing something. But anyway, there were some like really loud mechanical noises, like banging and crashing that happened. And all of a sudden she jumped up and she ran to the window and she said, "We're under attack." And she was dead serious. I thought she was kidding me. I thought it was like a bad joke. I thought she was kidding me, but she was dead serious. And I had to bring her out of it. I said, "Hey, they're doing construction at KU. It's okay." And she was just like, "Oh." And it was kind of like she came back. And, later on I said to her, "Wow, that's really, it was an intense traumatic, response you had." And she was like, "I'm not traumatized. That wasn't a traumatic response." I said, "It sure as hell was." You thought we were under attack, and these are sounds that I hear all the time at KU. And it was like she didn't want to admit that she had had this response. It was almost like she was embarrassed that she'd had this response. But, it was very, these are the kinds of things that happen. I remember then just like 2.5 years later, I was in DC at on my fellowship at DC, and I happened to be in DC when the attack on what's called the 3/11 attack occurred in Madrid, Spain, where some terrorists blew up a commuter train. And they blew that commuter train up, at least in response to Spain's participation in our invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, because Spain had sent some troops. And I remember being on the subway not long after that attack had occurred in DC, and how there were, every car was festooned with armed guards, and how quiet and pensive people were, because Washington had been one of the places that had been attacked, and now no subway system is safe. And there were various bomb threats and other things that occurred in DC and in New York City. None of them fortunately happened, but there were lots of threats. And I remember us, those of us who were on fellowship, a bunch of us getting together for lunch and saying, "Well, we thought, we kind of looked at the train map, of DC, and we were like, well, if they bombed here and here, they could take the whole system down, and we'd be stuck." But those are the kinds of things that changed our lives. And of course, now, 20 years on, we're in the middle of a pandemic still. We're pulling out of one of the most failed military adventures or misadventures that America has ever gone on. I was never for us going into either place, Iraq or Afghanistan. And we have failed both countries miserably. As far as I'm concerned, we squandered a moment after 9/11. But, we're in a world now that is much less safe, much less secure, much more divided. And a lot of it can be traced to that event. America did not show their best as a group, as a nation. We did not show our best face then to the rest of the world. Now, that being said, if you do choose to watch that documentary, the documentary that NBC has put out, called 9/11 Memory Box. It's a series of accounts that were done in the year following 9/11, of individuals who had been present, sometimes in the towers just around in New York or at the Pentagon. And they would just go into this video booth and they would just record their accounts of what had happened to them, in the months and year immediately after 9/11. That is a very good documentary. because they took some of those people. They obviously, for the documentary, curated these accounts. They got hundreds and hundreds of accounts, so they curated them a little bit. But they also located some of the same people 20 years, now, and had them come back and talk about what had happened in their lives since. And what is interesting about many of these people is that many of the things that they have chosen to do as a result of 9/11 demonstrate that on an individual level, many of these people made absolutely the best, perfect, most righteous, good choices in their lives. The most healing, the most thoughtful, the most, opening of their hearts kinds of choices, regardless of the pain, regardless of the trauma that many of them experienced, including losing loved ones, etc. In many ways, they're better people now, but because they had to be. They had to become that. But to me, what that demonstrates is that even though as a nation, I think we failed, our national leaders failed us, our policies failed us, individually, many of us have chosen better ways to be. I know that I have chosen a better way to be. My hair is white now. It wasn't white then. But many of us have chosen better ways to be, regardless of what our government has done, regardless of what our, the powers that be. No wonder we create conspiracies around these people. They're completely insane, or at least their policies are. Anyway, that is my reflection on this. And it's, for those of you who don't live in New York, this is a big deal. 9/11 is a big deal. It changed the landscape of the city. It changed whole people's lives forever. I still hear people talking about it, people who were there, people who witnessed it. It's, I'm sure that on Monday when I go to class, we'll talk about it. A student will, at least one student will ask me about it. It's that important. Not only as a kind of demarcation line, but as kind of the, as I think of it now, the tyranny and irony of memory, where we've come, where we should have come, where we could have been, and where we are. And with that, have a good weekend.